Hello, and welcome to the Peaceful Science Podcast. My name is Joshua Swamidass, and I'm your host. Across differences, even in areas of controversy, we aim to engage the grand question together. Joining me as co-host of the conversation today is Nathan H. Lents.
Dr. Swamidass is a scientist and a physician at Washington University in St. Louis, and is the author of The Genealogical Adam and Eve. Josh is also a Christian and the founder of Peaceful Science.
Now, Dr. Lents is a biologist at John Jay College in New York. He's the author of Human Errors and Not So Different. He's also an atheist. We have differences, but we seek common ground in the grand question: what does it mean to be human? Joining us today is J.P. Moreland. Professor Moreland is a philosopher and a theologian. He's also, let's see, where are you at, J.P.? You are currently the Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Talbot, the Theological School of Biola University.
It's actually, I'm at Biola University in the School of Religion and Philosophy.
Yeah,
so
and
they won't let me be in the School of Sciences. So,
yeah. And Dr. Moreland is a philosopher of mind. We invited him onto the podcast to talk about this really key question of the meaning of brains, the mind, and the soul, and how those may or may not be connected, and maybe even if the soul even exists and what that might be. And it really relates to large questions about how we recognize humanness in the fossil record, whether or not artificial intelligence one day could actually have a mind of itself, or could God even endow it with a soul, or does God need to even endow things with soul in the first place? There's a whole range of questions there, and Dr. Moreland's really written a lot about this and has found it to be an important question, and we wanted to engage it with him. So, JP, you want to add anything into that introduction with us?
sounds great.
Now, if you're joining us today, you can feel free to leave a question or comment, and when it makes sense, we'll just kind of drop that in. But for now, Nathan and I will kind of start the conversation with him. Before we get too deep into this, I want to start with some definitions. Can you guys tell me what the meaning could be of minds versus brains versus souls? Like, are those the same thing? Are they different? Are they connected? What's going on? I guess we could throw even into there just consciousness.
Well, it depends on which viewpoint you're going to embrace.
Maybe your viewpoint, JP.
Well, my viewpoint is that the soul. There's a book called A Brief History of the Soul by Getz and Tolliver with Blackwell, and it's a tremendous discussion of how the soul has been understood since a millennium before Plato and Aristotle. But basically, the soul is an immaterial or spiritual substance that has and unifies consciousness and animates the body. So it is a spiritual substance that has consciousness and unifies it and makes the body alive or animates the body. Now,
but that's the soul. So then how's that relate
all right.
to mind and brain?
Yes. So if you hold, like I do, to a version of Aristotelian or Thomistic dualism, then you see the soul as different than the mind. Descartes would say the soul and the mind are the same thing, because he reduced the soul to pure consciousness, to the possessor of pure consciousness. I think it has consciousness and the powers of life. So for me, the soul has a number of what we might call faculties.
Well, wait, so let's not go too fast. We get the definition. So we talked about the soul, which is this idea, to summarize what you're saying, this idea with a very deep history, which some people have really conflated with the mind, but you see it as different.
Well, the
mind
history
is like consciousness in a way, and it's some people, like Catholics, would call it a rational mind. So there's other types of minds, but there's a rational mind, and then the brain. That's the part that we as scientists have the best handle on, which is like the organ in our head that is somehow connected to the mind and somehow connected to the soul. Is that a good way to put it?
Well, no.
Okay. Correct.
My mistake, because I think I'm not being clear. By the way, the followers of Aquinas did not talk about a rational mind. They talked about a rational soul.
Yeah.
So the view I'm advancing is that the soul is like a chest of drawers that has compartments in it. And in each compartment, there are socks in one and T-shirts and sweaters in another. And we have what are called faculties. Indeed, the idea of a university faculty was built on the notion of the soul having faculties. Take the chemistry faculty. That is one compartment of the soul that has a group of things in it that are like one another more than the art faculty. Well, we have different compartments or faculties. One is the mind, one is the will, one are the emotions, and I could go on. We have at least 5 sensory faculties and so on. Now, a faculty then would be what I call a mode. It's not a part. It's not a part like you start with parts and put them together and get a table, where the whole is derived from the parts. Here, the whole is the soul, and there are different modes within it that contain the powers of reasoning and belief and thought. That's the mind, and so on. So, for example, some animals have souls but not minds because there's no evidence that they're capable of thinking. Others, there is evidence, but for some lower animals, it's pretty obvious they're conscious. And on this view, matter is just not the sort of thing that is qualified to be conscious. Now, what is consciousness? Well, just as water can exist in 3 states.
So is consciousness and the mind basically the same thing?
No.
Okay.
No. That would be to confuse the container with the thing that's contained. So water is not the same thing as the glass, and consciousness is not the same thing as the soul. So the entire soul is something that contains consciousness, and brings it into a unity. So consciousness would be different states in the soul. Like water can exist in solid, liquid, and gaseous states. The soul can exist in at least 5 states. It can have the state of the sensations, of thoughts, of beliefs, of desires, and of acts of volitional choice. Those are all modifications of the self or the soul. And it is the faculty of mind that contains states of thought and belief. It's the faculty of emotion that contains certain sensations and so on.
Okay, so it makes a little more sense, but now I want to push back a little bit because I can read Nathan's mind right now, and you want to unmute yourself too, Nathan, for this because I want to hear you explain it.
Are you reading his mind or his brain?
I think I can. Well, I don't have a scanner hooked up to his. But
you might be looking into my soul.
What's that, buddy?
He's looking into my soul.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, but wait. So this is where I think a lot of people are. So you've talked about a second substance that's non-material, but I do think there's actually there are reasons to question that. But I also think part of what's going on is a language gap here, and I want to clarify that. So, and I was thinking about how to do this. And tell me if I got this right, JP. Actually, I think I read this in your book, Scaling the Secular City, a very long time ago. Nathan, do you agree the number 3 exists?
Well, so I assume you mean the concept of the number 3, not like a numeral or yes, I believe
exactly.
3. There's a thing called threeness. Yes.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about a number in that sense is that it's actually not really. I mean, it's embodied. You can embody it. Like I put up 3 fingers, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not really. It's an actual entity that isn't really just a component of the parts, and it's not material either. Right. Is that type of thing you're trying to get at, or is there more to it than that?
Well, there's if I may, there's confusion going on about concepts and objects. The concept of red is not red. The concept of a duck is different from a duck. Numbers aren't concepts. They're properties, like I think Nathan said, there are threesomes or something. I think that numbers are properties that are possessed by groups. So a calcium ion has the property of being a certain chemical composition. It also has the property of being a twosome or having a positively charged to something. So
what I think this does is
just don't interrupt me for a second. Okay. Numbers then are to claim that numbers are objective and real is different than claiming that there are concepts of numbers, because there are some called nominalists that believe that numbers are nothing but words or concepts, and there are no numbers in the real world. And I think, Josh, for you to make your point that, well, we believe in numbers and surely they don't seem to be physical objects. Is that what you're getting at? I think to make that argument stick, you have to have numbers, not concepts of numbers. Even though I don't think concepts.
You're saying, but at least that puts it in a bit more of a realm where I think we can grasp the idea that there can be, because I think when you say material as a philosopher, I think you're talking about a very reductive sort of materialism, which I don't even think is how scientists think about it. I think scientists are thinking about, whether or not there's a new particle out there to discover. And is there actually another physical realm in a sense, or another material? Or, the way we would say it, and I think this is a potentially an unfortunate clash in language, is we would say, is there another, what is that second substance? How do we get our hands around that second substance? Is that possible for us to do? Or is it more like numbers? Or is it something more like something we could see in a particle accelerator?
It's easier to get a hold of the concept of a spiritual substance than it is matter. And the reason is this: science doesn't know anything about the nature of matter except for its dispositional properties. Science studies matter as iffy stuff or material. That is to say, it studies it such that if certain things happen to it, dispositions will be triggered, and that will cause something else. If you get down far enough and you ask, what is it that categorically fills out an atomic symbol or an electron, the only thing you're going to be able to say is stuff. There's nothing else. Now, you could describe an electron in terms of its dispositional iffiness, but trying to say what matter is in and of itself is almost impossible. Consciousness, however, is quite simple. If you want to grasp the nature of a soul, all you have to do is realize that the properties that characterize it are the ones you're aware of when you introspect. When you introspect, you have the properties of being such and such a thought, such and such a desire, such and such a sensation, such and such an emotion, and you can tell whether thoughts are coming to you as a passive recipient when another person's talking, and there's a different phenomenological texture when you choose to direct your mind towards a new area of thinking. That has the property of being what's called active power. Now, a soul is a unified substance characterized by those kinds of properties. And in fact, we can't know the external world without getting at it through one of these properties. So our knowledge of certain things is by way of sensations. If we don't have a sense of what a sensation is, I have no idea how we can use it to have a sense of an object in the external world. So there's no problem with a soul. A lot of times scientists think
this is a part where, so Nathan, I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are about what he said. Like, for me, it sounds like it would be understandable to scientists and atheists is just saying that at least some level, a soul is not the same necessarily, but it's just trying to grant legitimacy to the fact that we're not merely our atoms, that there is actual real experience we have. There's legitimacy. There's like a reality to our thoughts and who we are as people. Is that a good way to think about it? Does that bridge something meaningful on both sides, or is it just two different worlds still? What do you think, Nathan?
Well, I don't think I don't know any atheist that would say that the mind is nothing but the movement of atoms. The best definition of it that I've ever come across, at least the most succinct, is that the mind is what the brain does, and that consciousness is more than the sum of its parts. But the idea that something can be more than the sum of its parts is a basic principle of biology. It doesn't really require anything in addition. And so my question on the soul and how it animates the body is that I don't find that the physical definitions of mind are lacking that much that it requires another kind of substance. So to me, the mind is what the brain does has always been good enough. And I have a question along those lines, but I don't want to derail.
But what do you mean when you say he doesn't need another substance? What are you envisioning when you say substance? Because I have a feeling it's very different than what JP means. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe
it might be because the idea that the soul has a substance, an extra material substance, is a new one for me. I'm not a philosopher of mind, so I would need explanation on that before I could interrogate it. But the idea that we can have a mind that is an experience that's greater than just the movement of molecules doesn't seem controversial to me. But what is harder to defend, in my view, is that it requires something else other than that we already know exists, which is the brain and how it works. The idea that the mind can spring from it and does spring from it is very complicated. It's very complex. We certainly don't have it all worked out or understood. But it doesn't seem that too much is lacking for me in the explanations that we have in terms of a whole new kind of reality. That's why atheists would not see the necessity for a soul for animating the human body and mind.
Well, there's like this, so this history, JP, which I think was a misguided view in the first place. I don't think this actually really had much of an impact in philosophy of mind, but it certainly had an impact in popular culture. I think, around 100 years ago, there's a guy who tried to weigh people at the instant of their death. Right. And then he thought that he was able to show that there was I think, was it 13 grams a reduction? And so the thing is we can weigh the human soul. It's 18 grams. Now, that's not what you mean by a second substance, right?
Well, no. In fact,
but that's how I think we scientists kind of go there when you say that word. I think it's a technical term that's being misunderstood.
Good point. We got two confusions going on. And so I want to make sure that we don't make this one again.
Okay.
Please keep in mind the difference between something that has properties and has states versus the thing that has them. So again, it's the water in the beaker that has being liquid or being solid or being gas. So we want to keep clear the thing that has these states and properties versus the states and properties themselves. Now, when you talk about the reality of thoughts and sensations and beliefs, you're not talking about whether there's a soul or not. You're talking about the nature of consciousness. Now, that's a legitimate question, but that's a totally different question than whether there is something that possesses consciousness and what that sort of thing needs to be to do the right job. So let's not go back and forth between thoughts and states of consciousness and questions about its unifier and possessor. That's the first thing. Now, do you mind, Josh, if I go to the second one and then you can come back?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
I think there's a confusion between substance and stuff. Philosophers distinguish count nouns from mass terms. And the best way to illustrate this is by the sentence, Mary had a little lamb. If the term lamb is a count noun, then you can ask the question, where is the little guy? Or how many of them does she have? And there, the word lamb is a substance term because it's referring to something that is a fundamental unity of properties and modes and powers. It has properties, but it doesn't have. Nothing has it. And it remains the same through change. It can be literally the same lamb, even though it gains hair and loses its color. Now, if we use lamb as a stuff notion, Mary had a little lamb, the question would be, how much did she eat? And you could say 9 ounces. So then stuff is a quantitative notion that you can have more or less of. And a substance notion is different. It is an individual object that can remain the same through part replacement, and it possesses a unified cluster of attributes and so on. What I think Nathan and you would want to say about the brain And the body is not that it's a substance. You'd have a heck of a time showing that. I think you'd either want to say one of the following two things. Either the brain is a mereological aggregate, meaning that you have a group of parts, in this case, atoms and molecules and cells, and they come together in various bonding and other sorts of things philosophers call external relations to form a whole that's an aggregate of parts. Or probably another way to go is to do what more and more people are doing, is to deny that there are brains altogether. And instead, brains are like clouds. Do clouds exist? No. But there is something there, and what is it? It is a collection of water particles arranged cloud-wise. Well, brains, if you take a look at the atomic theory of matter, are largely regions of space that are filled with empty space, that have little tiny particles that are hundreds of thousands of miles away from each other at that level of measurement. And so it's got parts trailing off over here and new parts being sucked in over here, just like a cloud. And so it's probably, when I say the cloud is beautiful, what I really mean to say is that collection of water molecules arranged cloudwise is beautiful. When you say brains are real, there probably aren't any if you think that physics and chemistry give us the fundamental view of what's real. Instead, there's a collection of molecules arranged brainwise.
We think that biology gives us a fundamental view. No, I'm just kidding. But actually,
on an appropriate atheist view of the world, biology should in principle be reducible to chemistry.
No. So this is, I think there's a misunderstanding here on the science side. I think there's been on the philosophy side. So I think some popular proponents of science have sometimes adopted a reductionist rhetoric, but I don't think, especially when you talk to biologists, we don't actually see, we don't really see the world through a reductionist lens.
Well, and that's why there can be no atheistic naturalist explanation of living organisms.
Well, I mean, let's slow down a bit. So I think that there, I want to throw something else into this, which I think is going to be a bit clarifying, but I do think that there are some accounts. I think what you're trying to say, or the way I can understand it, is you think there's real weaknesses to that account.
Well, it doesn't.
I think your argument is strongest against reductive materialism or reductive approaches.
No. There are 6 different kinds of reduction, okay? And all of them fail. And the one that Nathan was promoting is called functionalist realization reduction. That's different than strict property reduction or anything like that. So Nathan's view that the mind is what the brain does is reductive. But it's a version of what's called functional realization reduction, where you functionalize mental types. So you say a pain is whatever, is some state or other that is typically caused by pinpricks that causes certain outputs. And the thing that plays the role of pain is a brain state, a
I wouldn't connect what he said to atheism, though. I think what's going on is that we're not philosophers. So I think it's like a colloquial way of explaining it. But let me throw something in. I think that's going to challenge Nathan a little bit and also challenge you a little bit, JP, to kind of clarify some things. I think artificial intelligence is a really interesting thought experiment. So, Nathan, you say that we kind of have a clear idea of how, the mind is produced by the brain. And, the fact of the matter is we're really far away from any artificial intelligence that has a mind. And so if I have a hard time, especially because I work with, cognition and computers. That's what I do in a great deal of my research. It's possible. I can grant that it's possible that we'll be able to make artificial intelligence that has a mind, but we're not anywhere near that. And it's not even like anyone knows how to do it or even how to know if we succeeded. That's some pretty big gaps to bridge. And so I think that challenges you. And I kind of hear your thoughts on that. But then for JP, I think, it seems like your account can't really preclude the idea that artificial intelligence could eventually have a mind. I kind of put myself more in the agnostic, but most substance dualists that I know would say that humans could never create a machine that actually had a genuine mind. And I think there's two things that unsettle that. One is like, I mean, how would you really know that? And let's say there is something that God has to endow upon it for it to have a mind. How do you know that God wouldn't do that to like a machine that humans created one day in the future? So, I mean, I think that, so how do you know if artificial intelligence can have a mind in the future? So I think that's like kind of an unsettling thought experiment, I think, for both of you to kind of work through. Like, do you think artificial intelligence can have a mind? What do you both think about that? You go ahead, JP. You can go first.
Well, I know I can't, and there is an in-principle problem.
Okay.
And you said, well, how would we know? Well, here's how we know. It is a fundamental principle of reality that you can't get something out of pure nothing.
But it's not pure nothing.
No, please stay with me, okay? All right. If you have your creation story is in the beginning were the particles, or wavicles, or strings, or whatever you want to call them. There's a Big Bang, and you have plasma and matter, as it is described by our best ideal chemistry and physics, just setting aside what in the world quantum physics is saying, because I think there are 14 different interpretations of the ontology of quantum physics. But if we grant that the creation story for a well thought out atheist, as almost,
but we're not talking about atheists. I'm a Christian, right?
Stay with me. A well thought out atheist who has clearly realized his responsibility to have a creation story. Then what is going to happen, as atheist and naturalist Colin McGinn has pointed out, is that story will be combinatorial. It will be a story that begins with the Big Bang and explains how different tiny, whatever they are, let's just call them particles, arranged to form larger and larger clumps of particles according to the laws of nature. And so what that will give you will be larger and larger, more complicated clusters of particles, all the way from galaxies to a cell. Now, the difficulty is that if you do that, you cannot explain the emergence of consciousness, because that would be to get something, sensations, thoughts, beliefs, desires, from entities that don't have the potentiality for that. They're brute matter. So that is why more and more atheists that are naturalists are abandoning a materialist view of the world in favor of panpsychism of some form or other. Leading figures are David Skirbina and David Chalmers. The reason they've done that is they acknowledge that if you start with matter, you can't get consciousness coming into existence, because just rearranging matter according to natural law, it's going to give you rearranged matter. There's no way that you can get something conscious from that. So what they do to solve the ex nihilo problem is they load all ultimate particles of matter with their own incipient consciousness.
But JP, we got to slow you down here, because you're arguing against people that aren't even here. Like we're not actually taking a reductive account. I mean, at least I'm not taking a reductive account. I'm not an atheist either.
Well, so I'm explaining to you why you can't get artificial intelligence.
Well,
and how do I know that? You said, how do you know that?
But then you went to atheism. So I'm saying from a Christian point of view, even if you want to go from there, how do you know?
Here's how we know that. You can't get consciousness by rearranging matter. So you can take machine parts that are, if you'll grant me, that our best description of them is probably what ideal physics and chemistry and maybe neuroscience says about them. But you're going to search in vain in any of those hard science textbooks to see anybody ascribing to matter sensations, thoughts, beliefs, desires, and so on. And so if you start with matter and rearrange them, Josh, what you're going to end up with is a syntactic engine, not a semantic engine. You'll end up with something that can run an algorithm, but it doesn't have any sentient awareness of anything. It can't think. There's no what it's like to be a computer. There is no what it is like to feel pain or to think that 2 and 2 is 4. What they are calculation machines, not conscious objects. Now, how could God just endow one with consciousness? No. And here's why. Because whenever a complex object, like say a car, by that I mean an object composed of a lot of parts, whenever you have a complex object that performs a function, it does that by distributing different functions to different members of the object, and the function of the whole is the result of the function of all of its distributed parts. Think of a car. Its ultimate function is to move down the road, and that is the result of the pistons and the spark plugs and so on, each doing its role. Now, if I were a brain, then, and we've also learned from neuroscience that this is even worse than the thought experiment. If I were a brain, the actions of my brain would be the result of actions of different regions and subregions and neurons that are wired together behaving in different ways to accomplish different functions. If that's true, then there is no explanation for the unity of my consciousness. Because if I look at a football game, there is a what it is like to see the field as a whole. But if my brain were what contained my sensations of sight, then one region of the brain would have what it's like to see the 1 yard line. Another part of the brain would have what it's like to see the 2 yard line. Another would, and there would be nothing I would be like a crowd of 80,000 people, each looking and having his neck strapped to look at only 1 square yard of the field. Material objects, because they're made out of complexes of parts, are simply not the kinds of things that are capable of explaining the unity of consciousness.
Well, I didn't ask if it explain it. I asked if it could house it.
No,
what's your thoughts on this?
It can't. I just told you why.
What's your thoughts on my thought experiment and how you think about it?
You talking to Nathan?
Yeah.
Yeah, who are you talking to?
I'm talking to you, Nathan. I want you to kind of.
I lost track of the question here.
Because JP kind of gave his thoughts about he doesn't think AI could ever have a mind. I imagine you think it could, but it clearly doesn't. Right. And so, I mean, how much do you really think?
Yeah, well, the fact that
we can't do that.
So the fact that we're far from getting general artificial intelligence rather than specialized artificial intelligence, to me that isn't evidence for anything either way, other than the fact that that minds are complex. Well, I think we all agree on that.
The idea that we understand how it all works, right?
Right. It's exactly. So we don't have to understand all of it to work to have evidence that it does and to evidence that it could. So do I think that in one day, as artificial intelligence develops further, could it have something that we recognize as a mind? I think absolutely we could, because we're not going to run into any sort of technical barriers. Because what we see is basically increasing complexity. And the same thing is true in the development of animal minds towards the evolution of the human mind, and even the development of the human mind through embryonic and early childhood development. I think that.
Well, how do you distinguish, Nathan, between artificial intelligence that had a really good simulation of a mind, like the appearance of a mind, but didn't actually have an inner mind, like an inner unity of self? That's the part I think that JP is saying.
Sure, but I think you have the same problem with humans and other humans and animals.
And the problem of other minds, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't think that is evidence one way or the other. I think that what we do know is that you can, the way that the mind springs from the brain can be tweaked by tweaking the brain. And so examples I've given before is certain parts of the brain are extremely sensitive to parasitic infection or intoxication with drugs or even injury, anatomical injury. And those will potentially permanently change the way the mind works. Now, I know that these are problems that philosophers have devised solutions to, but to me, they don't need a solution other than the fact that the mind springs from the brain. And if you make permanent damage to a brain, you change the way that mind works forever. And if the mind had an existence separate from the brain, you need another explanation for why physical changes to the brain or limitations to the brain, where you're talking about an ablation or a drug or, reversible effects. I mean, anybody who's taken psychedelic drugs, for example, can talk about an incredibly altered state of consciousness that then they can return to, and they still have access to it in terms of their memories, whether they're accurate or whatever. And so I think the mind springs from the brain. It has its own experience of it, and it's mysterious in many ways, but it doesn't necessarily require anything other than the physical matter we know exists. And that's what I rest my confidence on, that general artificial intelligence is possible. Is it desirable is an entirely other question. But is it possible? I don't see any barriers to that.
So
Josh,
go ahead, JB. I was gonna throw it back to you and kind of ask you like how you would make sense of that. It's like, how would you explain this connection between the brain and the mind, which is undoubtedly there?
There's a prior issue. Remember Nathan's definition of a mind. A mind is what the brain does. Now, if that's what a mind is, I see absolutely no problem with generating a mind. I could actually call the thermometer minded because it does things. And so that's one of the problems with functionalization of the mind, because it's hard to know why you would not count an automobile.
Well, no, I don't actually think that that's what's going on here, because
you don't let me get my thoughts out.
Sorry about that. Go ahead. I got to interrupt you.
I really do want a dialogue, but if you would just let me finish my thought.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So what I'm saying is that I don't see minds the way Nathan does, and if I did, I would have no problem, because it's obvious that if a mind is what a computer does, it can do things. But if a mind is something that is characterized by sentient states, that for which there is a what it is like to them. There's a what it's like to pain. There's a what it's like to a smell. There's a what it is like to thinking that P instead of thinking that Q, or fearing that P. If a mind is a unity of conscious phenomenal states for which there is a what it is like to them, matter does not have those properties. And so if you start loading matter with them, then you've abandoned materialism. If you grant that mindedness is to have a unified collection of what it is like states, then you will not be able to get consciousness from rearranging unconscious parts, because that's to get something from nothing. One more statement. Nathan uses the word springs from. But you see, the more technical term is emerge, that consciousness emerges when matter reaches a certain stage of complexity. The problem is, that is nothing but a name slapped onto a problem. It's certainly not a solution. And the problem is precisely, how could consciousness, quote, spring from brute matter? Now, you asked me, how do I explain the phenomena that Nathan pointed out? And my answer is, I lectured on this to a group of neuroscientists and research biologists at the National Institute of Health. There were about 130 that came. And I told them that when it comes to the nature of consciousness and its possessor, science has nothing to say about it. Nothing. What science can say is about causal dependencies, causal correlations, and causal interactions. Thomas Aquinas knew that if you got drunk, you wouldn't be able to think well. Or if you got hit on the head, it'd hurt. We've known since Solomon and Moses that there was a dependency of the mind on the brain and vice versa. By the way, Jeffrey Schwartz, world-class neuroscientist at UCLA, has proven that by changing the contents of your what it is like thoughts, in 3 weeks you can rewire your brain structure. It's called plasticity, neuroplasticity. So the brain depends on the mind, and the mind depends on the brain. It goes both ways. But look, if I'm in a car and strapped into the front seat and locked in the driver's seat, my ability to drive around town is going to depend on the car working. If something breaks down in the car, say the steering wheel won't turn left anymore, that'll limit what I can do, but that doesn't prove I'm the car. Same with the question of whether or not there's a soul has nothing to do with issues about causal dependency, because causal dependency is something that all dualists acknowledge is true, that the mind and the brain were meant to function in a unified way. And by the way, near-death experiences, there is such overwhelming evidence that they're real that it is beyond any reasonable doubt that bodies and experience things that they could not have known if it were oxygen deprivation or if it were a dying brain of some kind. And the things that they observed down the hospital wing or under the operating table. One guy saw a quarter that was a 1984 quarter, 10 feet high on a little cabinet. When he died, he went to the ceiling and saw it. A nurse climbed up and found it. There's all kinds of reports where people have been able to have knowledge and sensory experiences without any brain or body whatsoever. But while we're in the body, while we're in the car, if it's damaged, we can't function. If we can get out of the car, then the damaged car isn't going to affect us. That's how I explain it. Thank you.
So I don't want to go.
One thing I will say is that
go ahead.
The car and the driver, to me, mixes the mind-body with the mind-brain analogy a little bit. That's one thing. But maybe some more concrete questions on how this plays out could help put a finer point on this, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
I mean,
yeah, go ahead. Give a.
So I mean, so it's examples that you gave about near-death experiences, for example. I'm really surprised that you brought that up, because there's a lot of writings that have shown the description of near-death experiences follows very closely from a vivid explanation in popular culture, and then all of a sudden everyone's near-death experiences start to match this big thing that happened in pop culture, and the descriptions of it seem to change over time based on cultural things. But let me give you this example. So one reason that a lot of people think that there has to be something than just movement of the brain is the subjective experience that a lot of believers have with a God or something like this, an encounter with God and so forth. But what we also know is that those, and I assume that those have to be at least somewhat grounded in perception and the human mind, whether it's separate from the brain or not. But once again, we also often see that the nature of those experiences match the culture in which they happen much more closely than you would expect at random. And so the encounters that are experienced by believers in the Western world tend to draw them to Christ as a person, whereas in the Hindu world, for example, they would lead in a very different direction. And so if they were valid on their own and not just the product of things that spring from the brain, you wouldn't expect that correlation.
Well, I mean, I think that's... Well, I mean, we should probably do a whole episode looking at those sorts of things. I think that's mixing a couple things too. But I think there clearly is cultural impacts on our perception of these things. I think that's what you're getting at. But let me reframe this.
Even just the descriptions. I mean, even the concrete descriptions of these experiences.
But the point I want to make is that I think JP's coming. You would agree with this, I think, JP. You're coming into this conversation as a substance dualist, right?
Of a certain kind.
Yeah, but that's not the full range of Christian belief. I think there are faithful believers that you would disagree with, to be clear, and legitimately disagree with them, that would even call themselves Christian materialists or physicalists, like Nancy Murphy.
Yeah.
And they would say that a soul can't exist independent of a body. And I think one question, a technical question I have actually, so it's really the two poles. You have like the Christian physicalists on one hand, and then you have the substance dualists, I think, on the other, like JP. There's also the trichomists, but we're going to leave them out of the conversation for a moment. I've actually seen the most legitimacy, at least I wonder, a mediated position, which some people call hylomorphism, which is more of a Catholic view. And you quote Thomas Aquinas, but a lot of hylomorphic philosophers would actually say that the mind can't exist apart from the body. Like, how do you see where what you're saying is a substance dualist fits within that constellation of ideas, and what's the distinction between you and a hylomorphic?
Got it. I'll answer that. Nathan, I have a question for you. Can you just tell me what are 2 or 3 of the scholarly works defending NDEs that you've read?
Defending what?
Near-death experiences that you've read. Can you tell us something?
Off the top of my head, I have actually Walter Bradley gave me one. I forget I offhand. No, I can't.
Well, I don't mean to be mean-spirited here, but I doubt very seriously if you know what you're talking about in this.
Yeah, but let's actually share that data offline and talk about it, and maybe come back after discussing it. It's better to do that than just kind of cite something you can't read.
But
right?
It's not true that near-death experiences cross-culturally differ that much. There is a common core that approximately 300 million people in the world have had near-death experiences, and almost all of them involve a personal God, and they run contrary to people's religious training. For example, in India, people are taught that when you die, you are annihilated and merge with the all. But instead, people in India who have near-death experiences as Hindus retain their personal identity, meet a being that is personal, and a lot of times they describe it in a way that sounds an awful lot like Jesus Christ. And I will say that while the experiences of religious experiences and near-death experiences cross-culturally, the experiences themselves are widely identical.
But JP, I think what we really want to see is we want to actually look at that evidence ourselves. So I really want to get that offline from you.
I'll give you the books to read.
Yeah, we'll do that. So,
yeah, it's powerful. But the interpretation may differ. Now, that doesn't mean the experiences aren't the same. And I just wanted to correct the record on that. Yeah, hylomorphism. There are 2 versions of it. Neither one of them are physicalist. People who are trying to call Aristotle and Aquinas materialists are engaging in revisionist philosophy, and almost everybody recognizes that. For proof of this, I just edited a book a couple of years ago with Blackwell called The Blackwell Companion to Substance Dualism. And there are some chapters on what is Thomistic Aristotelian dualism. And it becomes very clear that Thomas believed in disembodied life after death. So so he was not a materialist.
Well, now, I don't think any of us are materialists either.
But you just said that there were Christians who were materialists, and you said, how does hylomorphism?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to figure that out.
And so I am starting by answering your question through saying,
sure.
Let's establish that it is not reducible to some physicalist position. Sure.
Yeah,
all right. Well, secondly, there are 2 versions of hylomorphism. One of them says that I am identical to a body-soul unity, so that the entire body-soul complex is itself a substance, not an aggregate of parts. On this view, then, the substantial form, or what is called my humanness, is not a universal that all humans have in common. It is instead my individual humanness, or my soul. And when you take it and combine it with a corpse, this isn't temporally, this is an ontological priority, not a temporal, or not a corpse laying around and you put the soul in it. But the corpse becomes a body because it is ensouled by the substantial form for that kind of hylomorphism. So the matter would be the corpse. That's the hule part. The morphe part is an immaterial substantial form, my individual humanness, namely my soul, and I'm identical to that whole thing. Another view that was held by the late medieval Aristotelians, beginning in the 1225 up to Locke, held that I and living organisms that have souls, which I believe they do, are identical to their souls. And so what you have is the soul and my soul would be humanness and what's called prime matter. That's a pure individuator that makes my soul different from your soul. Since we're both humans, I have this humanness, you have that humanness. So my soul is an individuated humanness, and the matter is the individuator. The body is an insouled physical structure. It is not entirely.
Let me. So we don't have a lot of time. So this is what I want to do. I want to pause, take one question from the audience here, and that I think is interesting. That I'm going to pull it up for a second, and I want to give one analogy I think has really helped make sense of it. I just want to get just a brief reaction from JP and Nathan. And Nathan actually had a question for you too, which I think is really important as well. Sound good?
Yeah.
Here's a question that we have. It's from Richard Howell. Would you sign up to be killed for a study if we had the tech to bring you back with 95% accuracy and effectiveness? And there's a couple issues that will come out from this. One is like, is that 5%, worth it? Let's say we just changed to 100%. You can imagine kind of like the Star Trek transporter of it's going to destroy everyone on one side, but then kind of reconstitute all your material there. Would you have any concern about stepping into that, Nathan? Or would you just think that because my matter's it's new matter over there, it's still the same person? How would you do that? How would you feel about that?
Right. This felt like the Star Trek problem that does it kill you every time it transports you?
Thanks to the continuity of the self.
Would I sign up for the study? Would I sign up for the study? The answer is very easy. That's a hard no for me. I would pass on that study unless I were terminally ill. Then it could be. I've always thought that those who give their body to science are giving the last great gift that they can to the world. So in that case, maybe. But I do. If you read Michael Shermer's latest book, which touches on some of the other things we talked about too, but I think that the pursuit of immortality is one of our greatest conceits. That's not. It leads us to poor decision making, I think, in a lot of ways. But I would not. Even as someone who's done aging research, I think our mortality is part of what's important to our nature. So no, I would not.
Yeah, there's a really great a series online called Altered Carbon where it talks about immortal people and are they really even human anymore? You start to wonder if they're not.
I don't like where that.
I mean, as a Christian, I do believe that I'll have immortality in heaven, but it does really raise questions that I think are legitimate about the human experience. JP, what about you? I think your answer would be absolutely no, right?
No, I'm not interested because unless my soul continued, I wouldn't be the same person.
So that's interesting. So we found common ground. None of us would do this study. I think it would raise more questions. Okay.
Unless I was terminally ill.
So I'll tell you, I mean, there has been real disagreements that we've talked about today. And we've gone back and forth. There's been constructive resistance. This hasn't been just like, let's all agree with each other. And I think that's actually one of our key motivating goals and values here is that we really want to engage across differences and really understand. Another comment really pointed out, I think, really accurately that there is just a huge. Let's see, where was that one? There was just a huge. Let's see here. I can't find it anymore, but someone noticed that there's a huge language gap. And I think that's absolutely true. I think it's really unfortunate, I think, that the philosophers use the term substance in this when it means something totally different than where our minds go as scientists. I mean, that doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It just means that we're not talking about the same thing.
Well, we were the first ones to use it. The scientists should come up with their own concept,
Yeah, maybe. Who knows?
I knew you were going to say that.
So, but I think one thing that's actually really valuable is being able to talk about differences. There's too much to get into this right now, so you shouldn't really feel any pressure to answer in total detail. But go ahead and ask your question, Nathan.
Well, we need to work up towards that. Do you have a hard stop time? Because I have a.
No, we can go. We can go as long as we need to. I mean,
I have a question about
10 minutes or so. How about that?
I want to talk about morality. Actually, it's one of the things that we talk a lot about on Peaceful Science is moral reasoning and a moral sense. And most secular philosophers, and I think you obviously are going to be aware that the vast majority, not vast majority, but a majority of philosophers are secular. And most scientists are secular. They hold that morality, moral reasoning, and a moral sense are the result of psychological and behavioral adaptations of our social cultural evolution. And so insofar as they exist as abstract concepts, it's really only in the mind, the human mind in our case, and we can talk about animal minds, which I was hoping we would get to, but we didn't. Well, so do you agree with the view that, I don't think you would agree with that, correct me if I'm wrong, but that you agree that morality has an existence unto itself, separate from minds reasoning about it and sensing it and acting on it. Do you believe in a concrete existence for morality, and what's the evidence that it exists on its own, separate from the actors and the thinkers?
I do.
And what do you base that on? What's the evidence? Is my question.
Well, the problem is not just morality; it's rationality as well, because there are normative states and principles of ethics, aesthetics, and rationality. For example, a normative mental state would be to be in the state Q if you were previously in the state if P, then Q and P. You ought to be in the state Q. You would be irrational not to be in that state. So there are normative oughts. If there are no normative oughts, then there is no such thing as reasoning. And there are no conclusions that people should, on pain of irrationality, accept. So I don't know. I would like to know how in the world you can explain the existence of normative rationality, given what you just said. And the same is true of morality. First of all, it's obvious that there are some things that are intrinsically right and wrong. Some are just self-evidently true. For example, torturing little babies for the fun of it is wrong. If the person doesn't know that, they need therapy, not an argument. Kindness is a virtue. Being a bigoted, lazy slob is a vice. Narcissistic slob. These are like 2 and 2 is 4. They're self-evident. And so that's the first thing I would say. And I would say that if you don't believe in such things, then there's nothing that you have any reason to be morally offended by. Because the difference between a child molester and Mother Teresa is the difference between preferring McDonald's or Burger King. It all turns out to be an evolutionarily inherited predisposition of preference. And I'm sorry, but preferences are not the sorts of things that rise to the level of taking offense at. I would not get offended if my neighbor went to Burger King. I love McDonald's. But if he were abusing his child, I would, because that would be to violate a duty that is much more significant than eating peas with a knife. And so on my worldview, it's very easy to see how there could be objective virtues and duties. And I think everybody knows that. If the evolutionary story is the only way we got here, and I will say I think a theistic evolutionary account would solve this problem, but if a natural...
Wait a minute, hold the presses. JP said something positive about theistic evolution.
Yeah.
Let him finish. Right. Let him finish.
Did I do something wrong? All right. Okay. It would solve the problem. But that is, we all know, as almost everybody who studies this recognizes, that the process of evolution...
I want to give him a chance to respond here. So
all right.
Now that you said something positive about theistic evolution, now we got to stop the conversation. But you're nodding your head, Nathan. I want to clarify. I don't think he's saying that you're amoral, immoral. That would be right.
I know he's not.
But I want to make clear that to viewers too.
No, I'm not saying
that atheists are immoral, because that's actually what some people actually think, and that's not.
I'm saying they can't justify objective morality.
It's more about the warrant.
Of it.
So you actually believe there are normative moral claims, I believe, Nathan. So
absolutely, and it really rests on a couple of things that we can access, and that's suffering, well-being. It's really not too hard to derive almost all moral decisions and moral rationality coming back to the what leads to suffering and what leads to well-being, an increase in well-being. And the examples that you gave are really easy to arrive at. Those are not moral conundrums, right? So I wish you had picked dicier ones, but I mean, child molesters and murder and torture and all that directly cause suffering. That's how easy it is to get there.
What's wrong with that if it gives me pleasure?
Because suffering hurts. Why
should I care about that?
So Nathan, I guess the question is, if you were talking to a sadist who said that I personally don't agree with you, that it's good to reduce suffering. I just want to reduce my suffering, and I have no problem with doing, just creating suffering for other people. And let's just say it's a real psychopath, a sadist there. So he doesn't agree with you on that presupposition. Of course, all three of us agree with you on that presupposition, but this guy doesn't. Is his presupposition wrong and yours right?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, and you can't divorce our morality from our social existence, because that's where it came from. So if you keep trying to, and I see Christians do this a lot, is that they keep focusing on the actions and consequences on an individual, divorcing them from the milieu in which all of this morality evolved in the first place. That's one thing. And secondly, hold on. And secondly, the other thing is, I actually had a question about psychopaths and sadists in mind, because to me, I can come up with a physical explanation for how somebody could be born with absolutely no moral reasoning. I think it'd be very hard, and these true psychopaths do exist, right? How would that? What's the explanation for them other than physical, anatomical damage or malformation that comes from that? And the question, I mean, I want to hear if people think that they have a soul.
Yeah. Oh, the answer is very simple. On my view, it's the result of defective brain genetics and your body. Remember, if my eyeball's put out or my optic nerve doesn't work, it's going to affect my soul's ability to have visual sensations. It's the same thing. If a person is going to have accurate moral awareness and behave correctly in a morally proper way, they're going to have a brain and a body that's functioning. Otherwise, they're going to be defective. And but the idea of being defective for you, I think, would have to be a statistical irregularity. For me, it's not being the way we were made to be. So I have a normative concept of defectivity, but I think you would require a statistical notion. And I'd like to ask, what do you mean by well-being anyway? You say, what do you mean?
I don't think that well-being has an absolute definition separated from place and time. And so I admit that it becomes very relativistic, and you get really close to the outright relativism when you take that to its conclusions. And I agree with that. And to me, that's where the interesting work here is when you touch around the border. But what I meant before by divorcing morality from its social context. So when you talk about a sadist who says, well, I don't care if it causes their suffering, so why is it wrong for him to do it? Because I don't think we operate as independent agents. And I do think that you do have the autonomy to act according to your own morality, but what you don't have is the autonomy to force others to suffer the consequences of your morality when it doesn't match with their own morality, right? And that's about autonomy, bodily autonomy, as well as just basic principles of freedom. But we create those, right? So I don't believe in anything like the concept of rights as a concept that just existed before we created them. We created rights and the concept of rights in a free society And it wasn't like an eternal concept that we just discovered. It was something that we decided based on our social cultural evolution that it's what's best for everybody as a collection of individuals, but as a collective of individuals that must live together as part.
Do you want to ask him a question? You had a hard question for him, right? Or do you want to pass?
Yeah, I do. So the question, because this is where I wanted to get into morality, and I'm talking with my children about morality and where morality comes from, and especially right now during the conditions on the ground in New York City, we're talking a lot about morality. And I noticed, JP, that you signed on to the Nashville Statement, and I was wondering, Nashville Statement on sex and marriage and so forth. And in a secular society, the society that we live in, it would be really hard. And I would challenge you: how would you explain to my 8 and 9-year-old the morality of your position that undermining our security as a family and our legal protections that we have as a family? We adopted them from foster care, just for context. So to
be clear, just so people can follow along here, JP is a conservative theologian at Biola. He signed.
I'm not a theologian, or philosopher.
Philosopher. He signed the Vanderbilt Statement on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Nathan is not just an atheist. He's also gay, married to a man, and has 2 kids that he just adopted. So it's a place where this isn't just for either of them. It's not just a bloodless conversation about morality. There's real deep things about identity here, and so he wants to know how you think about that in this context.
No, I want to put that fine point. I don't want to keep this abstract. I want to know how you would explain to my children that you're being moral when you try to undermine the legal protections we have as a family.
Okay. I would say to your son, Joey, I know that you love cotton candy, and so do your friends. And so let's suppose that whenever I brought home cotton candy for you and your buddies, the first thing that you did was to go out and stick it in the swimming pool, and it all got wet and dissolved. Okay. Well, I kept buying you new ones, and you kept doing that. At some point, if I were a good father, would I let you keep doing that? Or would I tell you that is not the way that candy was made to function, to give you pleasure and flourishing? So what I want you to do is to learn that you will be better off and flourish in the long run if you learn to use things the way they were properly made to function.
But see, I think we're talking past each other right now, because he said he was concerned about you undermining his rights. Was the Vanderbilt Statement even a political statement?
The Vanderbilt Statement is a moral statement, not a political statement. And
I asked about morality, the morality of the statement.
I know you did. So what I would do, Nathan, is I think that there is a way we were made to function. And if we don't, and that way makes us flourish and function humanly better than alternative ways. Just like driving a car in the bottom of the Pacific Ocean or dipping a cotton candy in a swimming pool is not going to work, because it isn't the way those things function best. Similarly, the human being was made to function in a way that is in keeping with loving, monogamous lifetime commitments in marriage. To engage in sex or activities contrary to that are going to harm a person in the long run. In order to avoid that harm, they're going to have to place certain priorities that will involve instant gratification, not just sexual, but instant happiness, on the front burner, and deeper and more long-term priorities are going to have to be suppressed in order to rationalize living in a way that everybody knows is contrary to the way we were made to function. I'm suggesting that human beings all over the world, ever since Neanderthals, have overwhelmingly known that, according to the natural moral law, our organs were made to function male, female, and it's evident to the senses, just like it is that a key goes in a keyhole and not a basketball hoop. And so
I want to slow us down here, because I really do think that we're talking past each other. I really do. So I mean, like, these are arguments I know for a fact Nathan has heard before. I
can't believe people are still saying them, because it goes against everything we know about the biology of sexuality.
There's a real disagreement here, and I just want to say that that's okay. And what I want to say is that it's actually part of the purpose of peaceful science is so we can actually have meaningful dialogue across that. This isn't going to be the focus of this conversation today. So what I want to end with is what I've kind of thought about as a helpful analogy for me. I want to hear all analogies work to some extent and they fail to others. And I'm kind of curious, just briefly, so I might even put a time clock on it of just 30 seconds, how Nathan thinks that this fails or succeeds or not. And, if you guys want to, go deeper on this question about morality in this specific case, maybe we'll do that again later. But I just don't want us to get too sidetracked onto an old debate. We got to think about how to frame that in a way that we're really engaging one another in a way that's going to hopefully make progress. I do think, I will say, the fact that we can even be here in the conversation together is progress in important ways. So here's my analogy, the way that's actually made sense of it to me, a certain type of halomorphism, I think. What if we think about the soul as software loosely and the brain a little bit like hardware? And you can have hardware without all the right configuration of bits to actually do the stuff of having a unified experience of using a word processor or talking to people on a stream, just because it doesn't have the right software. But if the soul is maybe a particular sort of software that brings it all together on the hardware, that doesn't necessarily imply anything non-physical other than things that are analogous to numbers. And it's encoded in matter. And you can even imagine it being on matter but not being realized, like a software not actually turned on or whatever. How well does software on hardware capture what we mean by the soul or the mind and the brain? Does that capture it? What do you think, Nathan? And 30 seconds, then I'll give JP the last word.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea of the mind, I wouldn't use the term the soul, but I would use the mind as software and the brain as hardware. It is an analogy, so it falls apart like all analogies if you take it too far. But in general, I think that's the way that a lot of secular, biologists like myself would think of it, and that those programs have increasing complexity throughout the diversity of life, and so that leads us to the conclusion that other animals have minds too. They're not like our minds, but they do have minds, and the programs are what lead you to make decisions. And yeah.
So I think that's helpful, because it's like a semi-physicalist account, but it also wouldn't be right to say that, well, that software is just the hardware. That would be a mistake. That would be a category.
Right, because software can't exist without hardware. Even in the computer analogy, right? You can't just have software in the air.
It grants a legitimacy to information as a second substance.
Yeah, right. And information as a substance is an interesting way to put it. Yeah.
What about you, JP?
I think it's a good limited analogy. I think that software is not physical. I think it is a set of ideas in the mind of the person who designed the software. And when you actually have a physical object, it isn't software. It's just a bunch of grooves and digital arrangements. So I think that information and software are utterly immaterial. I like the analogy. I think what it fails to get at is how we can unify this into one simple entity, and how we can how we can have free will, and how we can have sameness, even though our bodies undergo part replacement and aren't the same from one moment to the next. By the way,
it gets to this whole issue of, at least right now, none of us are in a moral quandary about turning off our computer and turning off.
Well, I was planning on being done, and I've got projects I've got to get done today.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, JP. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Would you come back and talk to us about some stuff in the future?
Good. And Nathan, I want to just make sure you know that I have utter regard for you, and there is no personal desire for me to express anything but respect and appreciation. So I just want you to make sure that I'm just talking about the views I have about the world and so on, and that's all I'm expressing. I don't mean anything directed about you in any way.
We'll work that out.
Thank you. I accept that. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely.
I think one of the challenging things about when there's disagreements is that, one way to handle it is just not talk about it. Another way is to actually bring it to the surface and even risk that. And so I think there's a risk, frankly, in those sorts of conversations, which is what we're trying to do. So once again, thank you for coming, JP. And I'm really glad to actually get you on tape with an endorsement of theistic evolution now. I'm going to be plastering that everywhere just for the fun of it. Just for the people who don't know what I'm talking about, he wrote a book, a very, very thick book, saying how theistic evolution is nonsense, and now he just endorsed it. This is amazing. Like, see how the progress we're making, Nathan?
What a country!
I can't hear you. You're on mute, man.
Oh, I just said you're a professional rabble rouser.
So great meeting you guys. Thanks
thank
a lot.
you guys.
And for the audience, thanks for joining us. Share this with people and follow the feed both on Facebook and on YouTube. This is our first episode in the podcast we're launching. Really soon we'll be meeting with Adam Rutherford on Monday, and then pretty soon with a philosopher of biology. We'll be discussing race. So come join these conversations. They're important. We're going to be talking with people across worldviews and really trying to make sense of things together. Thanks a lot.